Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and you're listening to Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. This episode of Unpacking Israeli History is generously sponsored by Andrea and Larry Gill and Lois Kahn-Klar and Gary Klar. If you're interested in sponsoring an episode of Unpacking Israeli History, or even just saying what's up to me, be in touch at noam@unpacked.media. Before we start, one more thing. As of just recently, we're also on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube. Just search Unpacking Israeli History and hit the follow or subscribe button. Okay, yalla, let's do this.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל. היא מדינת ישראל.
We, the people of Israel, are prepared and anxious to meet the representatives of our neighbors without any preconditions.
There are people in Israel and elsewhere say it's impossible to make peace between the Arabs and Israel or the Jewish people. I think they are wrong.
I'm not supposed to have favorites, but I think this episode is going to be one of my favorites. And I don't usually remember what I did on specific dates. Like, if you were alive, do you remember where you were on March 3rd, 2004? Or December 15th, 2023? I absolutely do not. But there are some dates that just stick. And they're the really important dates. Like March 29th, 1995, that's when Michael Jordan had the double nickel game. Or January 22nd, 2006, that's the day Kobe dropped 81. 81! Or April 2nd, 2023, that's when Caitlin Clark scored 41 points in the Final Four against South Carolina. Or Sunday, February 2nd, 2025, what happened? Okay, you know this now. That's the day of the Luka trade, which is like monumental in the NBA. And by the way, I found that out from my sister, Maayan, who dropped this knowledge on the rest of us siblings at 4:38 a.m. because she has the right priorities. We're a sports family, what can I say? So when I tell you that I remember May 1st, 2004 with singular clarity, you can safely assume that's not because it was some major historical event, though it maybe was, but it's also because a very big game happened on that day. And it wasn't just any big game. It was basketball history in the making as Maccabi Tel Aviv faced off against Skipper Bologna, which is not a brand of lunch meat, but the legendary Italian basketball team. And I remember every second of it. I spent most of the night at a Jerusalem restaurant called New Delhi. That's D-E-L-I as in meat, not D-E-L-H-I as in India. For kids like me, Anglo kids in the aughts in their post-high school year in Israel, New Delhi was one of those iconic Jerusalem hangouts. It was exactly what you might expect. A mix of Anglo accents, huge TVs everywhere, and massive, meaty sandwiches processed beyond recognition and absolutely drowning in dips and sauce. And I'm a real sauce guy. Garlic mayo, chimichurri, spicy mayo. Actually, anything orange. I'll take anything orange, really. If you give me an orange sauce, I will literally dip anything into it. And yes, Larry Gill, I said literally, even though I meant figuratively, but I said it. Okay, anyway, hope that's okay. Sorry, got distracted by the sauces. That happens sometimes. Where was I? Right, New Delhi, May 1st, 2004. Which, like the rest of the country, was in an absolute uproar.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Nokia Arena of Tel Aviv. It's the 2004 Euroleague title game. Maccabi Tel Aviv and 42 Skipper.
And again, I like sports. I like sports. Presumably anyone who shows up to watch the game is a sports guy, but that doesn't explain the pandemonium that erupted in New Delhi as Maccabi Tel Aviv sank basket after basket, muscling the Italians out of the way. And hold on to that word muscling for the very end of this episode. Because this wasn't just any springtime in the early 2000s, and this wasn't just any country spellbound by its national team. This was the spring of 2004. And while I was enjoying the heck out of my gap year in Israel, it wasn't an easy time to be there. The country was in the thick of the Second Intifada, the violent Palestinian uprising that claimed more than 5,000 lives. By now, suicide bombings were no longer breaking news. At least 36 Israelis had been killed by suicide bombs so far that year. By the end of 2004, that number would rise to 86 as terrorists boarded buses or entered restaurants or lingered by a shipping port with the express purpose of murdering as many Israelis as they could and having the intention of doing so. So no, it wasn't just a game. It was a moment of respite, an oasis of normalcy in a country where buses exploded regularly, and it was going very, very well. This wasn't Maccabi Tel Aviv's first rodeo, not by a long shot. The Pride of Israel, as they were called, had racked up 3 previous Euroleague championships in 77, 81, and 2001. But somehow, this felt different. For a few heady weeks in the spring of 2004, Israelis forgot their problems and their grief and their fears. Names like Derek Sharp,
Second foul for Derek Sharp.
David Bluthenthal,
Inbound to Bluthenthal and the basket.
Sharunas Jasikevicius,
Jasikevicius, and he makes it.
Tal Brody,
Tal Brody going all the way.
Nikola Vujicic,
We had a deep two-pointer scored by Nikola Vujicic.
and the great Anthony Parker were on everyone's lips.
Anthony Parker, who is one of the best players in the world, I think.
I'm not much for predictions. If history has taught me anything, it's to expect the unexpected, but I'm gonna make a prediction right now. I bet that 100 years from now, when my cyborg great-grandkids are effortlessly absorbing history lessons through the AI chips implanted in their brains, they're going to hear a lot about suicide bombings and uprisings and humans' general inability to be good to one another all around. But I don't want to teach history that way, darn it. Yes, the Second Intifada happened. Yes, 2001 to 2005 really were difficult for Israelis and Palestinians, but not even exploding buses can repress humans' inner light. Amid the horror, life went on. People got married, artists made art, Anglo teenagers showed up at New Delhi to watch Israel dominate on the basketball court. And that, to me, is just as much a part of the Second Intifada as all the bad stuff. Israelis and Palestinians, both, they're about so much more than conflict. They are real people. They are not political abstractions. Now, sometimes they're people with chaotic lives, sometimes with mundane lives, and sometimes dizzyingly joyful lives. And that joy was on full display in New Delhi on May 1st, 2004. This was why the Zionist movement had worked so hard to build a Jewish state. Really, I'm going with that. The success of the Zionist movement can be boiled down to a basketball game? Honestly, the answer is yes. Here's why. The story of Israel cannot and should not be reduced to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or story. It is about so much more than that. And I'll explain. When you think of Israel or Israelis, what do you picture? Close your eyes. What do you picture? My guess, and I could be wrong, is that you probably don't picture basketball. Heck, you probably don't picture height. Sari Nusayba, a Palestinian intellectual I find myself regularly coming back to, he once recounted, and I'm smiling as I say this, he once recounted that when he first met Israelis, he was so deeply confused. He'd grown up on stories of their might and power and ruthlessness, their prowess on the battlefield, their willingness to fight. He expected a nation of strong, swarthy Hulk types and was utterly confused to learn that most Israelis aren't rocking a six-pack, an Uzi, and a mustache. Far from it. Instead, most Israelis look like accountants. At least if accountants didn't own a single suit and dressed instead in cargo shorts and those Teva sandals, which, you know, you could have your debates on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are multiple sides of the issues, but those Teva sandals, I think we're all in agreement that they have to go. Okay, anyway, yeah, I said that. I threw shade. My bad. I'm sorry. Sorry to everyone. Okay, I'm going to move on. And look, I hate falling prey to stereotypes, but this one isn't exactly without merit. Jews are famous for their intellectual achievements and lactose intolerance, not typically their natural athleticism. So how did a team of Davids reach the pinnacle of a game geared for Goliaths? And this is a question you may not have asked yourself, but let me get it in your head right now. Why was a country in Southwest Asia competing in the Euroleague? If you're at all familiar with Israel's neighbors, you may already know the answer to the second question. The Jewish state plays soccer or football and basketball in European leagues for the simple reason that many Middle Eastern countries refuse to compete against them. In fact, here's a Nerd Corner alert. Gotta make t-shirts, by the way. Nerd Corner alert t-shirts. Let me know if you want one. We should get one for you. Anyway, in 1958, the Israeli soccer team qualified for the World Cup without playing a single game because no other country in the Asian and African leagues agreed to play against them. And this was 1958, friends. 67 had not yet happened. There was no military occupation, no checkpoints or walls, just some good old-fashioned anti-Zionism. Welcome to BDS before BDS. So instead of playing against their neighbors, Israel played against European teams, and they ruled. Are you surprised to hear that? Well, it's true. It's true, because this isn't one of those underdog stories like Cool Runnings or Remember the Titans or the 6-Day War that I freaking love. All of those stories, the Israeli teams were good. They were really good. A well-oiled machine working together like clockwork, rolling over opponents for fun. But their breakthrough didn't happen overnight. The story of Israel's love affair with basketball begins before Israel itself. Listen to this. In 1920s Mandate Palestine, where a handful of Jews played a niche game called basketball on uneven outdoor courts with improvised hoops and backboards. By 1933, basketball was big-ish enough that the Jerusalem YMCA opened the region's first indoor basketball court. Soon, Haifa and Tel Aviv started opening their own basketball clubs. Even the pre-Israel militias got in on the trend, setting up makeshift courts on military bases so soldiers could play between whatever it is that soldiers do. Target practice, competitive push-ups, painting their faces with that gross green and black oil paint. Yeah, you can tell I never served. You can tell. Love of the game accompanied these young soldiers even after they finished their mandatory army duty. And pretty soon, basketball leagues and community games were springing up all over Israel, including on the kibbutzim, those socialist agrarian collectives that we really need to talk about one day because, boy, are they famous. Kibbutzim are all about the collective over the individual. No wonder they embrace basketball, which is the ultimate team sport. Whether it's setting up a perfect pass, help side defense, or grabbing a clutch rebound, the game requires real coordination among players. And it's not just that the best players win. It's often the best chemistry wins. Soon, outdoor courts in the kibbutz center became communal hubs where residents gathered for games and events. Though most of Israel's early immigrants were from Europe, Southwest Asia, and North Africa, a handful of idealistic Americans were also drawn to the new Jewish state. They helped spread the game. And by the mid-1950s, Israel had formed the brand new and highly official Israel Basketball Association. The IBA established the Basketball Super League, a national competition played at the highest level. Israeli basketball had become a professional sport, and second only to soccer in popularity. Tel Aviv quickly became the epicenter of basketball in Israel. Imagine outdoor courts tucked between Bauhaus buildings or set against the backdrop of sandy beaches. You can hear the squeak of rubber soles on concrete mingling with cries of seagulls and the thud of bouncing balls and shouts from players, all while the rich fragrance of freshly baked burekas wafts from the neighborhood cafes. Note to self, get some burekas when I'm done recording. Players of all ages battled it out, while enthusiastic spectators leaned on fences or perched on nearby steps, drawn to the vibrant, chaotic energy. But for all their fervor, few Israelis realized that their national basketball team was on the brink of something extraordinary. For a tiny country, Israel had a baffling number of national teams, 12 in total. But the unquestioned king of them all was Maccabi Tel Aviv, aka the Yellows, Hatzeubim, creatively named after their yellow jerseys. By 1954, Maccabi Tel Aviv had already established itself as Israel's reigning champion, racking their first Israeli Super League title and winning all 22 games against fellow Israeli teams. It would be the first of their 57 Israeli Basketball Premier League championships, including a run of 23 in a row between 1970 and 1992. They were big fish in a very small pond. Actually, if you think about it, they're more like a great white in a fish tank. Just to give you some context, the next best Israeli basketball team, Hapoel Tel Aviv, holds 5 titles, while Hapoel Jerusalem holds 2. Again, Maccabi Tel Aviv, they've got 57. I'm going to stick my neck out there. I don't think any team in history has dominated a national sport quite like this. Unfortunately, the Yellows couldn't replicate their early national success on the European scene. They began competing in the Euroleague in 1960, but it wasn't until 1968 that they made it past the first round of Europe's top-tier tournament. Maccabi built their early success on local talent. But again, the country is teensy-weensy. They needed fresh blood, so in the mid-late 1960s, they began adding Jewish American players to the team sheet who raised the bar dramatically. One man in particular stands out. He's Israel's Michael Jordan. He's 6'2", he's quick, he's smart, and an excellent shooter and passer. He's also the first Israeli sports figure to win the Israel Prize. His name is Tal Brody, and he was one of the architects behind Israel's incredible win that day in May 2004. In 1967, Tal Brody had just graduated from the University of Illinois, and the world was his oyster. At 22, he was ranked among the top 10 basketball players across the entire United States. NBA teams jostled to sign him, but it was the Baltimore Bullets, now the Washington Wizards, who scooped him up. Brody moved into a bougie apartment in the city, ready for a glittering career in the NBA. Then, fate intervened. Brody traveled to Israel to represent the U.S. in the 1965 Maccabi Games, aka the Jewish Olympics, when Jewish athletes from all over the world come to Israel to duke it out against each other. It was the first time he'd been to Israel, and he was smitten. Based on what he'd learned in Sunday school, he came to Israel expecting to find, as he so memorably put it, quote, people riding on camels and living in tents. Misconceptions about Israel before visiting? Shocking. Can't imagine it. What he didn't expect was a fast-growing modern country made up of Jews from around the world. Tal Brody lit up the tournament, winning gold for the U.S. team. From the stands, a famous figure was taking note. Moshe Dayan, Israel's iconic eye-patched warrior statesman, could recognize talent when he saw it. He asked Brody to stay in Israel. And when Moshe Dayan asks you for anything, you don't say no. Unless you're an archaeologist trying to save precious artifacts that are being pilfered for Dayan's personal collection, but that's a story for another time and a bit of a deep cut. Sorry that you caught a stray, Dayan. Anyway, Judaism had been at best a peripheral presence in Brody's life, but visiting Israel sparked something deep inside him. And so he turned down the NBA and joined Maccabi Tel Aviv instead. Imagine giving up the freaking NBA to play for a tiny country with zero basketballing pedigree, a country that half the world demonizes and refuses to play against. Actually, you don't need to imagine it. You can hear all about it from Tal Brody himself. How cool is that? Because we had the privilege of sitting down with him as we researched this episode. And here's how he described his decision to defer his NBA career and spend a year in Israel instead. Because that's all he thought it would be at first, 1 year.
And the assistant coach brought me to the head of Maccabi Tel Aviv, the chairman, and he made a proposal. He said to me, well, look, you're a Jewish athlete. We're suffering, from a very serious recession in the country. People aren't smiling. Our basketball team never passed the first round of any European basketball championships. And if a guy like you would come, maybe you can take us to another level, to bring us to another place in Europe and put smiles on the people's faces. And you can make a change.
So Tal decided to take up the challenge. He had no idea that he was about to change Israeli basketball forever. From the moment he stepped off the plane, Tal Brody had serious main character energy. He was a great passer, an even better shooter. He was frighteningly quick, but above all, he had vision. Vision, on court, holding the ball calmly, looking around him. You could see the cogs of his brain whirring as he processed the geometry of the court, the space and angles and positioning, sizing up all the different options, crunching the data at 1 million bits per second, and then the move would explode into action, with the ball almost inevitably landing up in the basket. Brody's Israeli career began in 1966 when he propelled Maccabi Tel Aviv all the way to the finals of Europe's second-tier championship. The FIBA Cup was not as prestigious as the Euroleague, but at the same time, it was the gateway to Europe's premier competition. It's no longer around, by the way. And look, this might have been a second-tier championship, and they may have come in second, but no one really expected an Israeli sports team to get as far as it did. Getting to second place was a wild achievement. I mean, Maccabi wasn't exactly playing in state-of-the-art facilities.
Well, of course, the conditions and the facilities, let's say, for sport were like night and day. And at Illinois, we had a stadium, 16,618 a game, and in Israel, we played outdoors in the rain, in sandstorms, within farms, and in the cold in Jerusalem. The conditions were not the same.
But in spring of 1967, subpar athletic facilities weren't exactly a pressing problem for Israelis. The only thing they could focus on was dread, because this was the spring of 1967. Egypt and Syria were rattling their sabers. The entire state was steeling itself for what looked like a war of annihilation. The U.S. State Department sent Tal Brody a telegram advising him to leave Israel. He ignored them. Instead, he drove to the Jordanian border to train the Israeli soldiers in athletic drills. But by mid-June, the national dread had turned to a dizzy euphoria. Obviously, see our episodes about the Six-Day War for more on that. You should check them out. They're great. Anyway, Israelis reveled in their unlikely triumph. They packed the brand new 10,000-seater Yad Eliyahu Arena to watch the basketball games that had become a national source of pride. Tickets were almost impossible to get unless you were the prime minister who started showing up in the stands. That's right, the grandfatherly, Yiddish-speaking Levi Eshkol had become a basketball fan. Or at least, he was conscious that Maccabi Tel Aviv had serious nation-building potential. Under coach Ralph Klein, the team itself adapted their style of play, capitalizing on Brody's speed of thought and movement to embrace a more fast-paced, high-intensity game. By the way, you don't hear the name Ralph enough. If your name is Ralph, shout out to you. Email me, Ralph. Let's be friends. But somehow, when it came to the Euroleague, they couldn't replicate their hometown success. It took them almost a decade to advance beyond the quarterfinals. But when they did, the event came to be known as the Miracle on Hardwood. After the break, we'll talk all about it. Hey guys, it's Noam. Love learning about Israel? I know you do. You're listening to this right now. Well, now there's a way for the kids in your life to do the same. Introducing Unpacked at Camp, Kids Talk Israel, a new podcast for 8 to 11-year-olds. You could be 7, you could be 6, you could be 12, 13. Helping them explore Israel's history and culture through a podcast made just for them. In Unpacked at Camp, Kids Talk Israel, 3 kids document life at a Jewish summer camp while also learning important lessons about Israel, Judaism, and what it means to be Jewish. Find Unpacked at Camp, Kids Talk Israel, wherever you get your podcast, and share it with people who have kids. And not only there, there's also a YouTube channel called Unpacked Junior. Check it out. It's awesome. Where they can watch an amazing animated series about Israel. Like, this actually exists. So go spread the word to parents who you know will appreciate it. That's Unpacked Junior on YouTube. Subscribe. It's 1977 and Israel is not doing well. The country is in the midst of a deep economic recession and still reeling from the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The early excitement about national sports has dampened somewhat in the wake of the tragic 1972 Munich Olympic massacre of 11 Israeli athletes. You get a little wary of international competitions when your athletes are murdered on live TV in front of the entire world. Perhaps most unfairly of all, Israel is internationally being seen as a moral leper. 2 years before, the UN had adopted Resolution 3379, which declared Zionism, the belief that the Jewish people have a right to their ancestral homeland, to be a form of racism. And yes, we've got episodes on everything we just mentioned. So Maccabi's slow climb in the Euroleague was a welcome distraction. For the first time ever, they finally progressed beyond the quarterfinals, but it seemed like the bus would stop there. And if it had, I might never have sat in New Delhi with all of those sauces and dips that day in 2004, cheering like a maniac for a winning team. Thankfully, the bus didn't stop there. And what happened next would change Israeli sports history forever. The 1977 Euroleague semifinals game promised to be a nail-biter. Maccabi faced down the mighty CSKA Moscow, composed of the most elite players from 22 countries across the Soviet Union. This was the core of the Soviet team that had won gold at the Munich Olympics, defeating the previously invincible United States. And by the way, if you're going to hear my patriotism come out with anything, I am still upset about the United States losing that game. I just don't think it's fair. And frankly, I wasn't even alive then. And I can't get over it. That's the power of sports. Anyway, they'd taken home the Euroleague title 4 separate times, this team. And to make matters even more interesting, they'd refused to play against an Israeli team for the past 7 years. Mature, huh? Remember when I said that Israel was becoming a moral leper against the nations of the world? Well, the USSR had a lot to do with that. They were the sponsors of the UN resolution that declared Zionism to be racism. Low-key, it still tickles me pink. Do people still say that? Did they ever? That people don't realize that their chants of Zionism as racism are recycled Soviet propaganda from the 1970s. Like overly slim pants, it's just not cool anymore. When the fateful game rolled around in 1977, the Soviets were still ticked off about Israel winning the Six-Day War and utterly humiliating their Arab proxies, not to mention destroying billions of dollars worth of Soviet weaponry. And though the USSR was among the first to recognize the State of Israel in 1948, they'd long since severed all diplomatic ties with the country. So everyone was surprised when CSKA Moscow finally agreed to play against an Israeli team on one condition. The game had to be played in a neutral country. CSKA Moscow refused to compete on Israeli soil or issue Russian visas to the Israeli players so they could come to Moscow. So the Euroleague found an alternative: Belgium. This particular semifinal carried immense symbolic weight. This wasn't just basketball. This was a fight between a tiny, embattled nation and a global superpower that backed its enemies and refused to acknowledge its existence. On paper, Maccabi were under-resourced, outspent, and outmatched. But they had some secret weapons. The first was Tal Brody. The second was Mickey Berkovich, famous for his scoring ability and his tendency to win games in the final seconds. The third was Alcy Perry, a defensive linchpin known for his rebounding, shot blocking, and sheer physicality on court. Basically, just think like Draymond Green, but like with less spiciness. A player who existed just to spoil the party for the opposing team. Unlike Brody and Berkovich, Perry wasn't Jewish. Well, not yet. In the mid-1970s, Israel relaxed its recruitment rules, hoping to attract more top international talent. Perry answered the call in 1976, becoming one of the first African-American players to play in Israel. At 6'10", he towered over the other players. Soon his name was shorthand in Israel for a tall person. Let's bring that back. I want people to tell me I'm such an Alcy. I think it'd be awesome. Like Tal Brody, Alcy quickly fell in love with the Holy Land. Who doesn't? And in 1978, he even converted to Judaism, taking the name Elisha ben Avraham. But that's a story for a different day, because right now it's 1977 and Maccabi Tel Aviv was ready for whatever CSKA Moscow could throw at them. Back home, Israelis were glued to the broadcast on what was then the country's only TV channel.
Maccabi Tel Aviv, בתלבושת הבהירה, וצסקה מוסקבה.
Inside the Belgian arena, the energy was electrifying. The team walked into the stadium to find the stands plastered in Israeli flags and a huge Israeli crowd singing Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people live. Maccabi started strong with Tal Brody orchestrating the offense and Alcy Perry dominating the paint, the area around the hoop for you non-sports people, against CSKA's physical defenders. The Israeli supporters who had come all the way to Belgium were raucous. It was this energy that Tal remembers.
People weren't allowed out of Russia at that time to go cheer for, sport teams or whatnot. So out of 500, 498 were from Israel, raising Israeli flags, singing Israeli songs, Havenu Shalom Aleichem, Am Yisrael Chai, and the spirit was fantastic. And, and there only had 2 KGB agents, I think, that were cheering for them.
Ouch. Maccabi built up an early lead and maintained it for the duration of the first half, leading 41-38 at halftime. In the second half, CSKA intensified their efforts, pushing their large offensive players forward to close the deficit. But Maccabi's spirited defense hung on. As the seconds wound down, the crowd understood something big was about to happen. The final score, Maccabi Tel Aviv, 91. CSKA Moscow, 79.
אפילו השגריר הישראלי בבלגיה, יוסיף בן חורין,
The famous victory was captured in a 2016 documentary On the Map, whose title was taken from Tal Brody's post-match interview, where he uttered the instantly immortal words in broken American accented Hebrew. We are on the map, and we are staying on the map, not just in sports, but in everything. Nearly 50 years later, and the sentiment feels truer than ever.
It just burst out of me because, it was only 30 years after Israel was created, and it meant so much that for the country, the game was broadcast through satellite back to Israel. So it just came out that we are on the map. We are staying on the map, not only in sport, but in everything. And it turned out so because the Soviet Union broke apart. In other places in the world, things just disappeared. And in Israel, we're still there, and we're still going to be there.
The miracle on hardwood reverberated throughout Israel and across the Jewish world. Natan Sharansky, the Soviet refusenik who was arrested by the KGB the day after the victory, said that memories of the win gave him strength and courage throughout his 9 years imprisoned in Soviet labor camps.
When in the evening we heard on Voice of America that Israeli team won, we were more than happy to say to our KGB interrogators, wow, maybe you don't know, maybe you didn't hear. But your team, KGB team, lost to our young team. It was very happy moments that we could say it to KGB. A few weeks after this, I was arrested. And for 9 years, I disappeared from this world. And the voice, "Anachnu al hamapa," we are on the map, was always causing me a smile, even in the darkness of Soviet prison, and was giving me a feeling that we are on the map. We will win.
In Israel, the victory was more than a sporting triumph. For a brief, shining moment, the weight of geopolitical strife lifted, and the nation celebrated as one. More than 150,000 Israelis had crammed into what is now Rabin Square in Tel Aviv. When the Yellows clinched the win, the crowd went bonkers. The streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv thronged with jubilant crowds, waving flags, singing and chanting. Even the prime minister was feeling the love. Yitzhak Rabin had literally, there it is again, been about to resign over a banking scandal, but he pushed off the announcement so it wouldn't clash with coverage of the game. This is what happens when a country has only one TV channel. The good old days. Reportedly, after the game, he cried tears of joy and then resigned. Side note, banking scandal sounds really bad, but it was actually a pretty minor affair. Links in the show notes for more on that. The victory became a moment of collective catharsis and validation, a declaration of the Jewish state's place in the world. After that semifinal, the final felt almost like an afterthought. Maccabi were up against the heavily favored Italian champions, and correct me if I don't get it right, but let me give it a whirl. Mobilgirgi Varese, who had played in the previous 10 Euroleague finals in a row, winning 5 of them. And no, I don't know why these teams have such difficult names for people like me to pronounce. Yes, that might have been the most American thing I've ever said. My apologies. Despite the miracle on hardwood, Maccabi Tel Aviv didn't have much hope. The CSKA semifinal upset was considered a fluke. But again, Brody, Berkowitz, Perry, and the rest of the team were monumental. And again, Maccabi Tel Aviv delivered a major upset. And this time, it was even more nail-biting. The final score was 78-77. And there was more glory to come. Fresh from their EuroLeague win, Maccabi invited the reigning NBA champions, the Washington Bullets, who were the Baltimore Bullets prior. Now they're the Wizards, or the Zards, as I like to call them. They were invited to Tel Aviv for an exhibition match. For those paying close attention, this was the team that Tal Brody had turned down more than a decade before. Such an invite was unheard of. The EuroLeague team had never had the cheek to challenge a mighty NBA franchise, never mind the NBA champions. The Bullets accepted, though they privately felt like it was a total waste of time. This was a piddling little EuroLeague team, and they were the NBA. No doubt they thought they'd wipe the floor with Maccabi. They were wrong. On September 7th, 1978, in front of 10,000 delirious fans, Maccabi Tel Aviv became the first EuroLeague basketball team not just to play an NBA team, but to defeat them. Maccabi had become specialists in winning by the narrowest of margins. And here again, they eked out a thrilling 98-97 victory. And the Yellows kept racking up the wins, taking home their second Euroleague championship in 1981. It was official. Maccabi Tel Aviv was an international basketball powerhouse. Still, despite dominating the Israeli league and reaching the Euro finals 4 times, they wouldn't win another trophy until 2001, this time with the help of another MVP. Maccabi had poached Anthony Parker from the NBA. You might not remember the name Anthony Parker, but you might recognize the name Candace Parker, the legendary WNBA player. In his first season with Maccabi, Parker powered the Yellows all the way to the 2001 European title, defeating the old enemy CSKA in the semis and new rivals Greek superclub, all right, here we go again, Panathinaikos in the final. It was precisely at this moment in 2001 that coach Penny Gershon looked around him and noticed that many of his key players were getting a bit old. The team needed fresh blood, and so the coach, a fiery, no-nonsense legend in his own right, took the opportunity to rebuild, using the European trophy win as bait to lure some of the best players in world basketball. By this time, Israeli basketball had further relaxed recruitment restrictions, allowing teams to recruit more non-Jewish players. Following the fall of the Iron Curtain, Eastern Europe was a particularly fertile hunting ground for top talent. Like Šarūnas Jasikevičius of Lithuania, a master passer, dribbler, and shooter who became the engine driving the team's attack. And by the way, as a Baltimore guy, I used to love watching him at the University of Maryland. It was awesome watching him. I think he played with like Johnny Rhodes and Keith Booth at some point. Okay, I just went deep into the bag. Anyway, there was also Masio Bastin, another NBA recruit who glued the team together. His acrobatic leaps and impeccable timing made him a nightmare for opponents. They joined existing superstars like Derek Sharp, Maccabi's veteran, clutch, sharpshooter, and a massive fan favorite. There was also the young Tal Brody, blessed with a preternaturally great basketball brain and quickly developing into a great all-rounder. And of course, Anthony Parker, one of the most complete players Israeli basketball has ever seen. Like Tal Brody, he had real main character energy, that mysterious ability to bend the game to his will. Coach Penny Gershon was the perfect person to herd these extravagant talents, fashioning them into a team that transcended the sum of its parts. His coaching philosophy could be summed up in one expression: don't get in the way. He once described his job as making sure his team scored one more point than their opponents. I like that.
I see coaches speaking 90 seconds and it's not enough for them, and they shouting, and they make a big show, and they put the mic on them, and they painting like Picasso, and you cannot finish the paint in 90 seconds. This needs a couple of days.
So as the 2003-2004 season rolled, Maccabi were primed for something special, something that would maybe even eclipse the 1977 miracle on hardwood. But of course, at this time, most Israelis had something other than basketball on their minds. The Second Intifada changed everything. For 5 years, Israel's streets were fraught with fear. Collective grief seeped into every aspect of life. As I sat in New Delhi on that fateful day in 2004, internally, I felt like I was doing something defiant. Who is gathering in public these days? Especially for something as trivial as cheering on a basketball game? I'll tell you who. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people who refused to stop living their lives, despite how terrible the world can sometimes be. In other words, Israelis. And this is one of the fascinating things about Israel. A siren can sound at any time, summoning you to your safe room. But when the all clear sounds, Israelis are right back in the streets, buying coffee, smoking cigarettes, gossiping, playing, living, as though Iran didn't just send intercontinental ballistic missiles over the Temple Mount.
So we're quite disciplined. The country got disciplined. But the world doesn't take into consideration. For 20 years, the people living in the south of Israel were under rockets attack. And I went to a basketball practice in the south, and I saw the kids were running in the practice with cell phones in their pocket. And I says, well, hey, you're not allowed to be in a basketball practice with your cell phone. Put it on the side. He says, I can't, because if we have a rocket attack, my mom calls, and if I don't answer, it wouldn't be the rocket that kills me. She would kill me. So they don't consider the world, the pressure and the mental ability, the resilience that the people in the South lived under all these years.
It's depressing how little has changed since 2004 in some ways. So when Maccabi Tel Aviv took the court, they weren't just playing basketball. In bars and cafes and homes across the country, families and friends gathered together to watch the games, clinging to the sense of normalcy that sports provided. They forgot about the security concerns and the heartbreaking headlines, cheering their champion team all the way to sporting immortality. Maccabi swept through the early stages, destroying opponents with speed and skill and strategic brilliance. The movements were like silk. I remember the plays so well. Yasikevicius, the mastermind, holding the ball like a conductor before an orchestra, his calm presence defying the chaos around him. Derek Sharp, cool as ice, faking his shot, sending his opponent flying past him, and then an explosion of energy and just hitting these huge threes. I actually remember there's a three that changed the course of Israeli basketball just a month earlier. Got to play this clip. Oh, yeah, this is what I remember. Oh, my God. I just got chills. I remember that. And Maceo Baston soaring through the air to energize the team and the crowd. Nikola Vujic moving with feline grace and purpose, his eyes scanning the court for that perfect pass. Parker is just gorgeous shooting for him. You got to just see it. It's gorgeous. Pinning Gershon gesticulating wildly with windmill arms, willing the team to glory. The team's telepathic understanding, its cunning and craft, its fluid, choreographed movements. At times it was almost balletic. At other times, it was a demonstration of sheer force of will. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. They struggled a little in the round of 16 and needed a win in the last game to secure their passage. Luckily, they had Derek Sharp. Check this again.
Some dates have gained entry into the Euroleague Hall of Fame. For example, April the 8th, 2004. 10 years have passed since Derek Sharp's super shot took Maccabi Tel Aviv into overtime against Žalgiris Kaunas. A win allowed them to proceed to the Final Four. With Maccabi down 3 points, they needed a real miracle.
Gorshelev had just gotten into the game. There's 2.2 seconds left. He's going to take the ball out and he's telling me, Derek, go to the corner. I was just on the wing and I didn't move. I don't know, I just stood there. I didn't move. He told me move. I said, no, I'm not moving. I can't even feel the moment again because it was so out of body, you know. I didn't have time to think what to do. I didn't have a plan before. I just caught the ball, I dribbled, I shot it, you know, and the shot was not a shot that I usually shoot. I jumped, there was no real follow through. Two guys were jumping at me, it was crazy. Crazy shot, unbelievable. It wasn't me. I get all the credit, but God, you know, only God can make, you know, things like that.
Inevitably, Maccabi were drawn against the old foe, CSKA Moscow, in the semifinals. It was a rematch of a game a few months earlier in the group stages. Maccabi had trounced CSKA Moscow 83-80. Now CSKA was hungry for revenge.
כדור ארוך לפארקר. כדור הולך אל פארקר, מגיע אליו, פארקר עושה את הסיבוב, באזר, נכנס! מכבי מנצחת! איזה ניצחון!
Not just for that game, but for 1977 and all the many occasions Maccabi had put them to the sword since. It was another thriller. The Russians led for most of the first half of the game. But then, Maccabi pulled even for the first time.
אנחנו במשחק של 2 נקודות לצסקה, מכבי מחפשת לחזור ליתרון, ושזה לא קרה מהשניות הראשונות, ופארקר עושה את זה! יואו!
After this, they snatched the lead 5 minutes later.
49-48 למכבי.
And they never relinquished that lead. Maccabi won 93-85.
עם הניסיון הזה של הולדן, והנה זה נגמר! מכבי בגמר! מכבי תל אביב עולה לגמר הפיינל פור, כאן בתל אביב. גרשון אומר תודה רבה איבקוביץ', לא הצלחת לנצח אותי הפעם. וויצ'יץ' הולך לקהל כמנהגו אחרי ניצחון של מכבי.
The team carried that energy all the way to the finals, crushing Italian champions Skipper Bologna 118-74. The margin is staggering 44 points. It was the 8th time they'd crossed the magical 100-point threshold that year, and it was the most points ever scored in a European final.
No shot. The game is practically over. 10-9, and the celebration can start. 118-74 is a record as points scored in the final, and a difference between the two teams. And Maccabi Tel Aviv is the new Euroleague champions in 2004 here at Nokia Arena.
When the buzzer sounded, it wasn't just the crowd in the arena that erupted, it was an entire country. The joy was infectious. The streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem filled with celebration scenes that hadn't been seen since 1977. I remember the anxiety all day leading up to the game, but this was pure destruction, and in a good way. The Israeli team looked like they were possessed, that nobody would get in their way. With the dream team still intact, Maccabi repeated the trick in 2005, cruising to the title in even more emphatic fashion. That season, the team averaged a ludicrous 92 points a game, which, this isn't the NBA, that is a ton for this league. Later on that year, the Yellows achieved yet another milestone, beating an NBA team for the first time in 21 years. Their 105-103 win against the Toronto Raptors was also the first time ever that a European team had beaten an NBA team on North American soil. But the party had to end sometime. In 2006, chasing an unprecedented Euroleague three-peat, they fell agonizingly short in the finals. They went down 73-69 to, you guessed it, CSKA Moscow. CSKA finally got their revenge in the sweetest way possible. That loss had the air of finality to it. This was the end of an era. The NBA vultures were hovering. Anthony Parker was scooped up by the Toronto Raptors and became a quality player on a new team. Sharas Jasikevičius had signed with the Indiana Pacers the previous season. Maceo Bastin followed him in 2006. Nikola Vujic moved to Greece, while Derek Sharp's scoring touch left him a bit, and he retired a few years later. Of the Maccabi stars, only Burstein stuck around for another rebuild, becoming one of the greatest Israeli basketball players of all time. The band had broken up. A dynasty dissolved almost overnight. Maccabi have won only one EuroLeague championship since, and that was more than a decade ago. But the legacy, it lives on in Israeli basketball players like Omri Kaspi and now Deni Avdia, who is, as of February 2025, one of the best basketball players on the Portland Trail Blazers. And who knows, maybe one day the Yellows will stage a comeback and we'll have something new to celebrate. But even if they don't, their story is plenty inspiring. A reminder that even in the bleakest moments, there is still room for joy. So that's the story of Maccabi Tel Aviv's amazing 2004 win. And here are your 5 fast facts. Number 1, Israeli basketball teams had humble beginnings, but by the 60s, Maccabi Tel Aviv was a regional powerhouse. Number 2, in 1977, the team made history when they beat CSKA Moscow in the EuroLeague finals. The team's incredible talent, like Tal Brody and Alcy Perry, became national icons. By the way, some people even refer to Alcy Perry as the Shaquille O'Neal of Israel. Number 3, in the spring of 2004, Israel was in the height of the Second Intifada, the violent Palestinian uprising that claimed more than 5,000 lives, Palestinians and Israelis. Number 4, but for a few weeks in the spring of 2004, Israelis forgot their grief and their fears as Maccabi Tel Aviv once again crushed their opponents, walking away the EuroLeague champions. And number 5, in Israel, basketball is more than just a game. Amidst violence and geopolitical upheaval, Maccabi's victories offered the nation a rare moment of unity and relief. When that final buzzer sounded, it wasn't just the crowd in the arena that erupted. It was an entire country. And you know what? Number 6, I had garlic mayo, orange, spicy sauce that night, and it was awesome. Anyway, okay, too silly. Those are your 5 fast facts, but here's one enduring lesson as I see it. Here it is. I said at the beginning that the story of Maccabi Tel Aviv is a story of Zionism, and it is. It really is. Not the Zionism we often hear about, the belief that Jewish people have a right to live in their ancestral homeland, blah, 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 all true and important, but something so much more than that, because Zionism, if you want to understand it, is so much more than that. At the Second Zionist Conference on August 28, 1898, in Basel, Switzerland, Max Nordau, a disciple of Theodor Herzl, delivered a passionate speech on the topic of what was called muscular Judaism. He explained, Zionism breathes new life into Judaism. This much I am sure of. It does this morally by refreshing the ideals of the people, physically by the physical education of our offspring, who shall reestablish a bygone, muscular Judaism. Nordell was inspired by the 2nd century revolutionary Shimon Bar Kokhba, positing that once Jews, quote, connect with our oldest traditions, will again be broad-chested, strong-armed, bold-looking men. I said it myself earlier. When you think Jew, you don't think basketball legend. No, you don't. No, you don't. In fact, for centuries, many non-Jews saw us, Jewish people, as caricatures of ourselves. Look at medieval European art, which depicts Jews as pale and hunched and demonic, both pathetic and grotesque. And though today's stereotypes aren't quite as insulting, they're still pretty unflattering. I mean, would you rather be associated with Woody Allen or Brad Pitt? And look, I can poke fun at the lactose intolerance that plagues many of us, and glasses and accounting skills and whatever, because it's fun. And because, by the way, I'm none of those three, so maybe that's why I make fun of it. But I can also recognize that it's just a silly surface level stereotype. Jews are not inherently bookish or physically inferior. Jews have different ethnic backgrounds and cultures. We can make fun of silly stereotypes, even embrace or reclaim them if we want to. Seriously, you do you. But I speak as a Jewish person now. We have other options. None of us have to internalize this unhealthy idea that we're somehow weaker than everyone else, because it isn't true. And looking back on it, maybe that's why 2004 was so important for me. During the Second Intifada, every headline portrayed Israelis as either victims or oppressors, either body parts on an exploded bus or monsters in tanks. Israelis weren't just people. Israelis were statistics and stereotypes. Until that game on May 1st, when the world saw another side of the Jewish state, strong, self-confident, athletic, self-assured, winning, but without anyone dying. Non-Jews could look at Israel's victory and say, wow, look at that talent. And so could Jews. And once a Jewish person, or any person, has a healthy sense of self, well, his whole self-perception might change. Mine did. And it keeps changing, growing, expanding. Like when I watch highlights of Doron Sheffer playing at UConn in the 1990s, or when I see a bona fide NBA starter like Denny Avdia, it changes my self-perception, gives me, my kids, Jewish people all over the world, something to look up to, something to remember. The Jewish people are actors on the world stage, not just spectators. Zionism has turned the Jewish people from objects to subjects, from victims to masters of our own destiny, free to choose anything for ourselves, whether it's a career in athletics or accounting. Israel is so much more than just conflict. Zionism is so much more than just Jews returning home. Zionism is so much more than a rescue project. It's also those things. But really, it's the story of Jewish people returning to history as actors, as people with agency and power and choice, even amidst suicide bombings and stabbings and sadness and stress and, yes, conflict from all sides. If there's one thing I want you listening to please take away from this podcast, it's this. Please do not reduce the story of Israel to conflict and wars. Please don't do that. And there's no better example of that to me than May 1st, 2004, the day I dipped turkey pastrami sandwiches into spicy orange mayo sauce and danced in the streets, celebrating a victory that echoed across centuries. Israel was on the map. Israel is on the map. And that is the most empowering feeling I can imagine. Unpacking Israeli History is a production of Unpacked, a division of OpenDor Media. Check out JewishUnpacked.com for everything Unpacked related. And if you have any thoughts, ideas, or ruminations, you know I want to hear from you. So shoot me a note at noam@unpacked.media. This episode was produced by Rifki Stern. Our team for this episode includes Simon Apfel, Adi Elbaz, and Rob Pera. I'm your host, Noam Weissman. Thanks for listening. See you next week.